Hello, just wanted to let you know before we get started that I'm going to be making an exciting announcement later on in this video, so I'd love it if you would stick around to the end for that. But for now, on with the show. Hey there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author, editor, and longtime anime fan, and welcome to Let's Write With, the series where we use the power of anime to become better writers. If you're tired of writing advice that doesn't do much other than give you the same generic tips you've already heard a million times, you're in the right place. In this series, we take a more organic approach by looking at what other writers are doing, stealing their good ideas, and hopefully figuring out how to avoid their mistakes. Today, we're going to do that by talking about a mystery thriller anime called ERASED. But first, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be focusing primarily on the anime version of ERASED. There are actually multiple versions of the story, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment, but I think the anime makes some unique choices that are kind of interesting to talk about, so that's why we're going to focus on that. So, as you might expect, this video will contain spoilers for all 12 episodes of the anime. And this includes spoilers for the end of the show. The Erased anime has a pretty notorious ending, and we're going to be talking a little bit about why that might be. Finally, while I'd argue that this show is maybe PG-13 at most, it does cover some pretty heavy themes, including child abuse and abductions. I wouldn't say anything on screen is particularly graphic, but I would recommend that you make sure you're in a good headspace for that kind of content before you watch either the show or this video. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk story. Erased started out as a manga by Kei Sanbei called Boku Dake ga Inai Machi, or The Town Where Only I Am Missing. It's also sometimes translated as The Town Without Me. The manga was serialized in Young Ace magazine from 2012 through 2016. The anime was released in 2016, and there's also a live-action movie that came out the same year, as well as a live-action Netflix series that was released in 2017. The story follows Satoru Fujinuma, an apathetic 29-year-old manga artist whose career and life are going nowhere. Satoru frequently experiences a phenomenon he calls revival. He will sometimes inexplicably travel back in time a few minutes, giving him the chance to prevent a catastrophe. This doesn't tend to end well for him, although he is usually able to fix whatever revival was warning him about. Case in point, a revival-based rescue involving a child and a runaway truck lands him in the hospital. This prompts his mom, Sachiko, to come to town to look after him, which he is not super excited about. During her stay, Sachiko mentions a series of child abductions that took place in their hometown when Satoru was in elementary school. The culprit was supposedly caught, but the result never sat well with Satoru, to the point where he's basically let the adults in his life convince him to forget about it. While Satoru and Sachiko are at the store one day, Sachiko sees an attempted kidnapping that leads her to a realization regarding the case from all those years ago. Later, Satoru returns home to find her murdered. The police immediately suspect him, and in a panic, he tries to run. Revival activates, landing him back much further than he's ever gone before. Now he's in 1988, inhabiting his not-quite 11-year-old body just before the child abduction started. Satoru decides that this is his chance to prevent the kidnappings from ever happening, saving both his classmates and his mom, who was clearly on to the bad guy in the present. But time is working against him, and if Satoru isn't careful, his attempts to be a hero might just end up getting more people killed, including himself. In this video, we're going to look at 3 different story elements and try to pick apart how they're working or not working, and what we can take away to help with our own writing. The elements we're going to address are mechanics, genre, and pacing. Mechanics. Every story involves some sort of mechanics or an underlying sense of how things work. This could be anything from a magic system to a set of rules that govern how your characters act. The mechanics of Erased revolve around time travel and Satoru's use of revival to try to save his 3 classmates who were kidnapped and later turned up dead. So given all of that, it's a little weird that revival is never fully explained. Revival. Satoru first describes how revival works in episode 1. He notes that he always goes back 1 to 5 minutes right before something bad happens. And despite his misgivings, he always gets involved trying to prevent that bad thing. But there's never any explanation of how he got this power to begin with, or even how it's activated. In fact, it seems like it's mostly completely out of his control. That said, there is some indication that Satoru's intense emotions can trigger revival, at least sometimes. In episode 5, after Satoru has been working hard to protect his classmate Kayo Hinazuki, the first kidnapping victim, he learns that his efforts have failed and she's still disappeared. Passing by Kayo's apartment, he sees her mother throwing out a bag that contains the mittens Kayo was knitting for Satoru, and she doesn't seem at all concerned about her missing and potentially dead daughter. Satoru is so upset he starts running, and finds himself back in 2006. Without consciously intending to, Satoru has given himself another chance to find out more about the killer and to protect the victims. In episode 7, after being caught by the police and noticing someone he thinks is the killer watching from the sidelines, Satoru actively tries to initiate revival for the first time. He's in emotional distress here too, believing that this is his last chance to go back and fix things. This is the last time Satoru uses revival, and it's the only time he uses it for a specific purpose, to go back to 1988 and save Kayo and the other victims. If you read reviews of Erased, you'll probably come across a fair amount of criticism when it comes to revival. Sure, it's a cool time travel mechanic, but what about all those unanswered questions? Why can Satoru sometimes consciously cause it to happen, while other times it seems random? What makes him think there's a limit on the number of times he can go back to prevent the murders? Why was he sent so far back in the first place when he's only ever gone back a few minutes before? The simplest and perhaps least generous explanation is that this mechanic wasn't really well thought out, and it only exists to move the plot forward, not to make sense. But this also brings up an interesting question of whether or not the mechanic needs to be fleshed out, and if so, how much. This is tricky because, on the one hand, not explaining your mechanics can distract your audience and take them out of the story. If they're focusing on trying to figure out what exactly revival is and how it works, then they're not focusing on things like character and plot and themes. On the other hand, getting into the weeds about every single detail of your mechanic may not be necessary as long as the audience can understand what's going on. Time travel is complicated. To be fair, it's not like we don't get any explanation. As I mentioned before, Satoru does give us a basic breakdown of how revival works in episode 1. And we also get an idea of how his time travel is affecting the world around him. Satoru's initial goal is to save Kayo by getting her past X day, the day she originally disappeared. But as soon as he thinks he's managed it, Satoru realizes the events he's trying to prevent are still happening, just in a slightly different way. Protecting Kayo through X day just means that she's disappeared a little later than she did the first time around. When Satoru returns to the present and tries to lie low at his coworker Airi's place, she shows him a publication about the 1988 murders. Satoru realizes that the details have changed from when he last read it, and now Kayo's date of disappearance is shown as March 3rd rather than March 1st. Although Satoru failed to save her, this proves that he can change things, which makes him long for one more chance to make things right. So we don't know all the details of how time travel works, but we do see that it's possible to change the timeline. This is something I go back and forth on every time I watch Erased. For me personally, I can totally enjoy the story without all the details of that mechanic, but at the same time I can understand how frustrating it is to not have those details. Part of the reason I'm willing to give it a bit of a pass is because of what we'll talk about in the next section on genre. But I do think we need to acknowledge how important it is to stay on top of the mechanics in your story. Because if you keep your audience in the dark about how things work, they may get annoyed and give up on your story, which is not what you want. Writing takeaways on mechanics. 1. A story's mechanics are the inner workings of, well, how things work. Whether it's a magic system or a societal rule, mechanics are important to explain because of what they mean for your characters and your world. 2. Should you decide not to explain your mechanics, or not explain them entirely, you run the risk of alienating your audience, or just diverting their attention from the story to why the heck things are happening the way they are. This is not the same as building mystery and intrigue that you'll explain later. This is just failing to fully orient your reader to how things work in your story. 3. Depending on what kind of story you're writing, and what kind of writer you are, the amount of explanation your mechanics requires can vary greatly. The trick is to find a good balance of trusting your audience to figure things out, while also giving them enough information to do so. An unexplained mechanic can feel like a get-out-of-jail-free card rather than a cool writing choice, so it's important to consider how your mechanics work and why they work that way. Genre. Erased is marketed primarily as a mystery thriller with some supernatural elements. However, that's really only one part of the story, because Erased is actually more of a multi-genre story, blending mystery elements with character-driven drama. Now, multi-genre stories are very common and can be done really well, but they do come with some potential pitfalls. Genre number 1, mystery thriller. The mystery element of Erased is set up pretty quickly in episode 1. We get hints about the childhood abductions that Satoru has tried to forget, the creepy would-be kidnapper that Sachiko sees at the grocery store parking lot, and of course Sachiko's murder and Satoru being labeled as the potential killer. So right away, we've got several mysteries to solve and a protagonist who needs to clear his name. Pretty typical mystery thriller stuff with the added supernatural element of time travel. Once Satoru goes back in time, the story gets straight into setting up the suspects, or at least making us question why the cast is being so shady. Yuki, Satoru's neighborhood friend, is shown to be a sweetheart who cares about kids who are lonely and need extra support. But he is also shown creepily watching Satoru and Kaio from afar, something he seems to do with a lot of the area kids. And of course, he's the one who was originally tagged as the culprit and is currently on death row in 2006. Satoru's classmate Kenya is smart and insightful, dedicated to looking out for Satoru, even if he doesn't quite understand what's going on. But he also seems pretty darn suspicious of Satoru, and his being called to the teacher's office at the end of episode 4 is framed as extremely sketchy. There's no real question that Kaio's mother, Akemi, is beating her, but there's also no real evidence that she should be a murder suspect. That said, she's just kind of generally creepy, both in terms of how she treats Kaio, and in terms of her lack of concern when Kaio goes missing during Satoru's first revival. Satoru's teacher, Gaku Yashiro, displays a lot of good intuition about his students, and is really dedicated to helping Satoru extract Kaio from her abusive circumstances. But his willingness to share Kaio's personal information is a little uncomfortable, as is his advice to Satoru about getting close to the third potential victim. Unfortunately, a suspicious cast and a bit of tension can't quite make up for some bigger mystery genre issues. First off, there's never really any doubt who the killer is. If you develop a theory after the first couple of episodes, you're probably right. And even if you're someone like me who is very bad at figuring out who the killer is, there's still the issue of the details not quite adding up. For example, in 2006, after his first failed revival, Satoru goes to his mom's former coworker, Makoto Sawada, for help. Sawada is a journalist who is working on the abduction cases, even though they've supposedly been solved. He doesn't believe Satoru killed Sachiko, and he wants to help Satoru find out the truth. Sawada gives Satoru 2 lists of possible suspects, compiled in 1988 after the original 3 abductions and murders took place. The first list includes the initial suspects, and the second includes a revised selection based on a change in the killer's MO. We later learn that the real killer's name was on those lists, except that we never actually saw it. The narrative is basically claiming important information was there without actually showing us. This is a tricky element of the mystery genre. If you withhold information so that the audience can't figure out who done it, and then go back and claim it was there the whole time, you're gonna make your audience feel like they've been manipulated. There are other aspects of the mystery that don't really add up. Things about how the murders were carried out and how red herrings are dealt with, but it basically all comes down to one conclusion. Erased isn't a flawed mystery thriller because it's not really a mystery thriller at all. That's just the scaffolding. Erased is actually a character-driven drama. Genre number 2, drama. There are a million different ways to define drama, but in the case of Erased, we're basically talking about a fairly serious story that focuses on characters, relationships, and plot. Despite all the time travel and mystery stuff, I would argue that here is where the story is really focused, on these characters and how the passage of time and their experiences change them. Satoru. As our protagonist, Satoru goes through the biggest changes in the story, although I guess you could say that it's less about changes and more about rediscovering who he is. The Satoru we meet in episode 1 is actually a little hard to root for. His conflict about being emotionally open is understandable, but it's made him deeply apathetic and bland. He chooses to work at a pizza place and stay disconnected from his peers rather than figuring out what he really wants from his manga career. As his coworker Ayuri points out when she visits him after the truck incident, he sort of has a bubble around him that he uses to keep people out. It's never quite stated in these terms, but I always assumed Satoru's apathy has to do with his childhood and the way the adults in town tried to make the kids forget about what happened. For Satoru, this seems to have led to him being really closed off and having difficulty forming healthy bonds. But returning to 1988 changes all of that. Whereas Satoru once blamed himself for Kaio's disappearance and death and tried to forget the whole thing, he now jumps at the opportunity to make things right. And even more than that, he starts to genuinely appreciate all of the things he took for granted before, like eating meals with his mom. He also learns to open up a bit more to his friends, especially Kenya, who helps him plot ways to keep Kaio and the other victims safe. This is a Satoru who is more open and genuine with his emotions because he doesn't have to repress trauma this time around. In fact, he's actively working to prevent it. Satoru's efforts to protect the 3 potential victims focuses largely on making friends. He starts with Kaio, a loner who with a horrible home life and a sense that the people around her are all fakes. Satoru allows himself to be vulnerable around her, which in turn helps her feel safe enough to open up. This is part of his goal to essentially target people who are alone and help them feel more supported and cared for. Because if they're not alone, then they can't be easy marks for the killer. But Satoru's character growth isn't really about solving the mystery. It's about going back to that childhood version of himself that was more open and hopeful and driven. A lot of this does have to do with his mission and his relationships with his childhood friends, but I'd be remiss if I didn't also talk about Airi. Airi Katagiri is Satoru's co-worker from the pizza place. She's always been friendly, to Satoru's confusion, but they're not particularly close. However, when Satoru is trying to hide from the police, who think he killed his mom, Airi is the one who believes in him the most. In episode 5, she helps him without being asked. She also tells him about a time when her father was accused of doing something he didn't do, and how that made her want to believe in others. Even when her own life is put in danger, Airi still does everything she can to help. Satoru's relationships and his ability to accept their importance in his life is what really leads to the biggest change in his character. I think the best example of this is toward the end of the series. After saving the victims in 1988, Satoru has a run-in with the murderer that lands him in a coma for 15 years. When he wakes up, he doesn't remember who tried to kill him, and the last bit of the show involves him trying to regain his memories and confront the culprit to put an end to things. What's striking about this isn't so much the ploy to catch the murderer, although we will definitely be talking about that. To me, it's really Satoru's monologue in episode 12 about having lost a huge chunk of his life. Rather than be upset about this, he sees it as something to be treasured because the time he lost is when his friends and family were looking after him and fighting to figure out the case. Thanks to all of his efforts to build healthier relationships, the Satoru we see at the end of the series is very different from the one we started with. His dream of being a successful manga artist is now actually being fulfilled. Over the credits, we see scenes of him returning to Hokkaido to visit his friends, with whom he's clearly still close. And in a really sweet post-credits scene, we see him reuniting with Airi, who hasn't met him yet in this timeline, but whose faith in him has clearly had a huge impact. But Satoru isn't the only character who undergoes some pretty big changes. Kaio. As the first of the 3 murder victims, Kaio is sometimes more of a plot point than a person. But she does have her own character development throughout the series, largely due to her relationship with Satoru. When we meet her, Kaio is an aggressively closed-off 10-year-old who is being abused by her mother and thinks she has no hope of escape. When Satoru says he wants to be friends, she immediately calls him out for being someone who's just putting on an act in order to fit in. But Satoru is persistent and genuine, and he slowly becomes Kaio's first real connection to others. He stands up for her against schoolroom bullies, invites her to a joint birthday party, and begins to change the way Kaio sees herself and the world. Kaio also develops a close bond with Sachiko, whom she sees as a sort of surrogate mother. Sachiko and Satoru represent what a healthy mother-child relationship should look like, which is completely outside of Kaio's experience. If you're not feeling something during the scene where Kaio has a meltdown over being offered breakfast, you may have a heart of stone. It's telling that when Satoru and his friends worry about the fact that Kaio will be taken away once child services separates her from her mom, Kaio says she's not concerned. She's actually thankful that Satoru and the others have been helping her. And she even suggests that they say it was her idea, not Satoru's, to hide her in the school bus to get her mom in trouble. Whereas Kaio was once avoiding people at all costs, she's now actively thanking them and coming up with ways to protect them. Now, to the people who wish Kaio had waited for Satoru while he was in his coma, I get it. Their relationship is kind of built up to be romantic, or at least as romantic as is appropriate for 10 to 11-year-olds. This is where I sort of wish the anime had had more of the manga to adapt, because this is a really important part of Kaio's character. The last volume of the manga, published in 2016 after the anime was finished, is made up of short stories depicting what the rest of the cast went through while Satoru was in a coma. Kaio's story specifically addresses the issue of waiting. We see that Kaio is basically prepared to give up her entire life to wait for Satoru, to the point where both Sachiko and Kenya are concerned for her. Ultimately, Sachiko moves Satoru away and leaves Kaio a note saying that Satoru would have wanted her to move on. The whole point of saving her, after all, was to give her a chance to live her own life. So when Satoru finally meets Kaio again after waking up from the coma, we're really seeing the culmination of Kaio's fight for survival, inspired and supported by her friendship with Satoru. She now has a loving family and a life of her own. Sachiko. I wouldn't say Sachiko goes through the same kind of transformation as other characters in the story, but she does change in large part because of her relationship with her son. When we first meet Sachiko in the original timeline, she's well-meaning but a bit obnoxious. After hearing that Satoru was in an accident, she immediately comes to the city to stay with him, without asking him if he actually wants her to, and proceeds to take up space, smoke and drink, and even talk about sightseeing. Through Sachiko, we learn about the kidnappings from Satoru's childhood, and the adults' choice to try to hide them from the kids so they wouldn't be traumatized. This, as we've already discussed, backfired entirely and actually led to a lot of the problems that Satoru is having in the present. It also seems to have soured his relationship with Sachiko. They aren't super close, and Satoru seems mostly annoyed by her. But I think it's telling that Sachiko's first thought as she's dying in that first timeline is that she needs to apologize to Satoru for not believing him that Yuki was innocent, now that she suspects who the real killer is. And one of the first things Satoru does in 1988 is rush back home to see Sachiko. The Sachiko of 1988 is much more openly maternal, and not just because of all that cooking. When Satoru and Kaio nearly get into a scuffle with Kaio's mom, Sachiko shows up to protect them. She talks about wanting to support Satoru's conviction and even reaches out to Akemi, noting that as single parents, their households are similar. Afterward, she asks Satoru if she overstepped her bounds by butting in, but he's actually grateful for her support. Seeing his determination, she encourages Satoru to continue helping Kaio. And she even goes a step further when it becomes obvious that Satoru has a plan up his sleeve that he's not telling her. She flat out asks him if he's doing something bad, and when he says no, she lets it go. She even gives him food to give to Kaio, who is currently being hidden in an abandoned bus by Satoru and his friends. Although Satoru doesn't realize that that's what Sachiko is doing, Kaio is the one who later makes the connection. And when circumstances force Satoru to bring Kaio home, Sachiko welcomes Kaio and takes care of her like she's family. All of this culminates in Sachiko's participation in the final showdown with Akemi. Sachiko actually gets injured here, but she's willing to face the danger because she and Yashiro, the kid's teacher, have worked out a plan to get child services to address the issue. The changes in Sachiko's character over the course of the series are pretty subtle. It's more like our perception of her is changing. Like, it's not initially obvious what a great mom she is, but after Satoru travels back to 1988, we get lots of examples of how hard she's working to give her kid the best shot at life. This is even more true during the time Satoru is in a coma. For 15 years, Sachiko's life centers around keeping him healthy and fiercely believing that he'll wake up someday. When he finally does wake up, Sachiko initially goes back to her earlier MO and tries to protect him by keeping him from remembering too much about what happened to him. However, when faced with Satoru's friends and their concerns, Sachiko changes her mind and realizes that she can't just keep them from talking about bad things indefinitely. The best thing for Satoru now is to understand how he got here and figure out how to move forward. Like Satoru, Sachiko's development as a character isn't so much about change as it is about getting back to who she was. Someone who adores her kid and trusts him to be as brave and insightful as she is. Kenya. I love the smart guy trope, so of course we're going to talk about the smart guy character. And also, I think Kenya's character arc is a good example of what basically all of Satoru's friends go through over the course of their relationships with him. Kenya is one of Satoru's friends from 1988. He's observant enough to have noticed what's going on with Kaio, but until Satoru starts taking action, Kenya doesn't do much other than notice. However, their frequent stairwell discussions lead Kenya to step up and offer his help in protecting Kaio. He never really figures out the deal with Satoru's time travel, but he's willing to believe that Satoru's concern for Kaio and the other victims is real. He even has a line that's very similar to Airi's about choosing to believe in someone even if there's no evidence. He also pretty quickly realizes that Satoru is trying to save more than just Kaio, and he reminds Satoru that he has friends who can help. Kenya is more of a supporting character, so he's not really as fully developed as some of the other characters we've talked about. But I do think he shows just how much Satoru is affecting the other people in his life and causing them to change in ways they might not otherwise have changed. Because Kenya himself admits that he probably wouldn't have taken action on Kaio's behalf if not for Satoru. Not because he's a horrible person, but because he's 11 years old and his dad's a lawyer, and he understands how difficult it would be to make a difference in a situation like hers. But thanks to Satoru, Kenya learns how to be more proactive and fight for the things he believes in. During the 15 years Satoru is in a coma, Kenya is busy becoming a lawyer and working with Saura to connect what happened to Satoru with a series of abduction cases. The manga actually delves into this a little further by showing how Kenya spent years trying to earn his dad's respect in order to access the documents he needed to build a case. Finding out the truth behind what happened to Satoru and its connection to a string of child abductions becomes Kenya's driving motivation for 15 years. When Satoru wakes up and begins regaining his memories, Kenya is the one who immediately notices, along with the fact that Satoru is hiding it. Satoru explains that he doesn't think there's much of a chance of bringing the killer in after so long and with no real evidence, but Kenya reminds him that he has friends who are ready and willing to help him make a difference. I bring up the way that Kenya moves from being more passive to being more active because I think it's a really good example of how the changes that Satoru is going through are affecting the people around him. Of course, not all of these changes are good changes. Yashiro-sensei. If you put your money on the intuitive, kind-hearted teacher being the killer, you are correct. Gaku Yashiro is Satoru's homeroom teacher, and he seems like a stand-up guy who cares about his students and is even willing to go out on a limb and put himself in danger to protect them. He talks to Satoru honestly about Kaio's situation and does everything he can to get child services involved so that she can be safe. Satoru even sees him as a bit of a father figure, which says a lot since Satoru's own father has been out of the picture since Satoru was very young. The changes that Yashiro goes through during the story are less about fundamental changes to his character and more about how our perception of him changes. So kind of like Sachiko, really. Like Kenya, Yashiro says that Satoru has inspired him to step up and take a more active role in difficult situations like Kaio's. However, in Yashiro's case, this mostly means that Yashiro becomes obsessed with Satoru as he tries to figure out how Satoru keeps disrupting his plans. There are actually some really interesting parallels between Yashiro and Satoru. One of the first inklings we get that Yashiro is not what he seems is during a conversation with Satoru about how to approach Aya, the third potential victim. Yashiro's advice is basically to do whatever it takes to get Aya to relax her guard, using shared interests as weapons. It's a cute scene on the surface, an awkward but well-meaning adult trying to help a kid make friends. But it's kind of hard to dismiss the fact that what he's describing is also the way a killer might cozy up to his next mark. And in episode 10, the way Yashiro describes his efforts to get close to Satoru sound awfully familiar. Ultimately, Yashiro's actions are all about trying to fill an emptiness inside of him. Not unlike the way Satoru's actions during Revival have been about rekindling his own ability to find direction and emotional openness after he shut those things down during the original timeline. When Yashiro attempts to drown Satoru in his car, he explains that he truly respects Satoru and promises to try not to kill anyone else in town. And when Satoru lives and is stuck in a coma for 15 years, Yashiro doesn't try to kill him. In fact, as soon as Satoru is awake, Yashiro goes to see him, probably to gauge what Satoru remembers so he can act accordingly. But as Satoru points out during their final confrontation in episode 12, that was a pretty stupid move on Yashiro's part. Getting rid of Satoru while he was in a coma would have been the smart way to cover his tracks. But Yashiro didn't do that, because Satoru helps bring his life meaning. Satoru is the only way Yashiro can find some direction and purpose. In the original timeline, Yashiro is a killer who knows how to play the game. A large part of why he doesn't get caught is because he always has someone like Yuki to take the fall for him. Now, after getting to know Satoru, Yashiro has become someone who can't quite give up the game, even though that would be better for him in the long run. He's gotten sloppy because he's now attached to his greatest mark. And this has a huge impact on the resolution of his story, which we'll get to in a little bit. A story that dips into multiple genres has a lot of really interesting opportunities for new approaches to storytelling. But it's important to make sure that you're hitting all of the vital elements of each genre. A mystery that builds realistically, a drama that has a lot of juicy character arcs. There's a lot of interesting things to play with when it comes to multi-genre stories, but it's also really easy to fumble each individual genre if you're not careful. Writing takeaways on genre. 1. Including aspects of multiple genres in your story can be a really fun and interesting approach. However, it's important to be clear on how you plan to use the best aspects of each genre. Is your mystery appropriately suspenseful? Is your drama appropriately heartfelt? Each genre has its own focus for a reason, so you need to know what's special about the ones you want to use and how you're going to convey that to your audience. 2. A good drama focuses on putting interesting characters into difficult situations and showing us how they change, or don't change. If your characters are changing over the course of the story, how and why? And how do these changes affect the people around them? Knowing what you're aiming for here can go a long way toward making your story relatable and engaging. 3. Don't forget that your villains can change too. And this can be more than just increasingly desperate attempts to do nefarious things. Relationships between heroes and villains can be just as complex and interesting as relationships between heroes and their loved ones. So even if you're not planning an elaborate redemption arc, consider how your villain is evolving alongside your hero and their companions. Pacing. Before we talk about the end of Erased, I want to talk a little bit about one of the broader issues, namely pacing. Erased has only 12 episodes to fit in 8 volumes of manga, which is not rushed exactly, but pretty quick. It's probably just as well that the 9th volume with the side stories wasn't available yet. Anyway, that's a lot of story to squeeze in, which means a lot of plot points to balance. Balancing plot threads. The main plot about Satoru using revival to go back in time, in part to prevent Sachiko's death, is pretty quickly set up in episodes 1 and 2. So it makes sense that the show wastes no time in showing us how affected Satoru is by seeing his old home, and by seeing his mother still alive. But then the main focus of the story shifts very quickly to put the Kaio issue above all else. Sachiko's death ends up being more of a lead-in to the real plot rather than an important plot point in and of itself. The plotline involving Kaio's abusive home and Satoru's efforts to protect her take up about 75% of the series. That leaves only about 25% to deal with the last 2 cases, Satoru's run-in with the killer, the coma, Satoru waking up from the coma and trying to regain his memories, and his final showdown with Yashiro. And that leads to some kind of awkward pacing issues. For example, after 8.5 episodes that focus almost entirely on Kaio's story, the anime shifts sort of abruptly to Hiromi and Aya, the last 2 victims. Before now, there's been very little time spent on either of them, even though Hiromi is supposedly one of Satoru's closest friends. Now the story needs to pick up those threads very quickly because there are only about 3 episodes left in the series. And it needs to resolve them quickly too, which is probably why the Hiromi-Aya plot points are finished up between mid-episode 9 and mid-episode 10. And then we rush into the first confrontation between Satoru and Yashiro, followed by the coma, which leaves us with a little over 1 episode for the final showdown. To be clear, it's not like there's some rule for exactly how long you have to spend on each plot point, but there can be some whiplash in terms of pacing if the story gives different plot points such different weights. Scrambling to balance plot points can also cause problems when it comes to resolving things. Endings. So at long last, it's time to talk about Erased's notorious ending. First off, a quick rundown of the actual events. Satoru wakes up from his coma after 15 years and is transferred to a hospital where it becomes clear that he's lost a big chunk of his memories. Those start to come back after Kaio visits, and Satoru remembers that Yashiro tried to kill him and is still on the loose. With the help of Kenya and Hiromi, Satoru arranges to be left alone with Yashiro, who is now a politician who frequently donates to and visits the hospital. Yashiro, thinking this is his chance to finally kill Satoru, takes him to the roof to do just that. However, as the two talk, it becomes clear that Yashiro doesn't really want to kill Satoru. In fact, he doesn't see any point to living without Satoru being alive to be his enemy. Things get a little muddy here amidst all the melodrama, but basically, when Yashiro does finally let Satoru fall off the roof, it turns out that Satoru and his friends anticipated the move, so all Yashiro gets is arrested for trying to kill a patient. There are a lot of things that don't hold up with this ending, and the pacing really doesn't help. The initial idea to try to secretly record Yashiro talking about past crimes isn't a bad one. But that's out the window almost immediately, which just leaves monologuing on an empty roof. Are there no security cameras? Is no one looking for a missing patient? Clearly, Satoru is expecting to be thrown off the roof, since he has his friends ready to catch him at the bottom, but how did he know that that's what Yashiro was going to do? And what's the deal with Yashiro's plan to frame Satoru for the murder of Kumi, another young patient? Why would he set that up and plan to make Satoru falling off the roof look like a guilty reaction? I guess it sort of makes sense, given that Yashiro usually sets up someone else to take the blame when he kills someone, but why would anyone believe that Satoru would kill Kumi to begin with? And if Yashiro believes that Satoru is his reason for living, why would he still let Satoru fall? Why would he prefer that, and potentially following Satoru over the edge, rather than figuring out some way for their cat and mouse game to continue? Messy climaxes like this are often caused by a lack of attention to detail, because there's just too much story to fit into such a small time period. That's why getting pacing right is so essential. This won't necessarily solve all of the story's problems. For example, the erased manga and live-action drama have more time to build up to their endings, but those endings also have their issues. But not having to rush your ending gives you time to really build up your characters' motivations so their actions make sense. Which is a pretty big deal for a final showdown, since that's what your entire story has been building to. Writing takeaways on pacing. 1. In a plot-heavy story, keeping track of all the threads you have going can quickly get complicated, especially if you're trying to cram a whole lot of story into a short period of time. Favoring one plotline over another isn't necessarily a problem. Subplots are a thing. But it's best to be mindful about how you do it, and to make sure everything has its proper conclusion. 2. Endings can be a huge indicator of how well you've paced your story, which means it's important to take the time to build toward your climax. Taking that kind of care will help make sure that you have enough time to tie everything together in a satisfactory way. 3. If you don't take the time to tie things up in a satisfactory way, you'll probably leave your readers with questions and a sense that your story didn't come together well. Your audience has come with you this far. It's important to make it worth their while. Conclusion. So, let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. A story's mechanics are the ins and outs of how things work in this fictional world. No matter what kind of story you're telling, it's important to think about how the rules will affect your characters, and what your audience needs to know about those rules. 2. There's no real right or wrong answer when it comes to figuring out how much of your mechanics you need to explain. The important thing is to ground your reader in your world enough that things seem logical, and there aren't so many questions that your audience stops paying attention to the story because they're fretting about how something works. There's intrigue around something that will be explained later, and then there's just keeping your readers in the dark and annoying them. 3. Not every story fits solidly into one and only one genre. But if you're going to combine genres, it's important to know each genre's strengths and weaknesses and how you're going to filter your story through them. 4. Whether we're talking mystery or thriller or drama, a key component of most good stories is interesting characters and interesting relationships. While not every character changes significantly in every story, the way characters engage with and influence each other can go a long way toward giving your story depth and meaning. 5. A complicated plot can be a good thing, but it can also be a very messy thing if you don't plan your pacing accordingly. If you have a lot of plot lines to explore, it's worth taking a look at how much space you need to do that effectively, so you're not crunched come climax time. 6. Endings are often the place where inconsistencies of plot and pacing get aired out, usually unintentionally. Your ending is where you really want to drive home all of your character arcs, plot twists, and themes, so it's very important to make sure you've given yourself the time and space to do so. If you haven't done that, you'll probably hear about it from readers. Tangent. Okay, so this isn't writing related per se, but it does have to do with storytelling, and I think it's pretty cool, so let's talk about it. The anime version of Erased uses some really interesting visual and audio tricks to tell the story. The most obvious one is the narration. When Satoru is in 1988, we see and hear him as a child. But when we hear his inner monologue, it's delivered by Shinosuke Mitsushima, his adult voice actor. And when Satoru wakes up from his coma, we get a neat reversal of this. We're seeing his actions as an adult, but until he regains his memories, his internal narration is done by Tao Tsuchiya, his child voice actor. This creates a really interesting cognitive dissonance both for the character and for the audience. Because as a time traveler, Satoru has multiple versions of himself in his head, and this is a cool way of showing it that avoids a lot of clunky monologuing. The coma also leads to some interesting visual choices. The opening credits for episode 11, when Satoru's fate is up in the air, is the same opening we've seen for every episode, except Satoru has been removed from every scene. It's a literal depiction of being erased. By the end of the episode, we know that Satoru is back in the game, and so he's back in the opening for episode 12. There are some other neat visuals too, with the film representing Satoru's memories being destroyed as he sinks into his coma, and restored as his memories are restored. Even if you're a writer who isn't focusing on a more visual medium like anime, it can still be really interesting and inspiring to look at how visuals can affect storytelling, even if it's just an excuse to be impressed with how clever animators are. As I mentioned at the top of this video, I have an exciting announcement to make, and this is it. Hidden Bonds, the third book in my urban fantasy trilogy, the Compound series, is now available for pre-order. If you are a fan of cranky empaths, magical conspiracies, and queer romance, this is the series for you. There's more information on pre-ordering book 3 and on the rest of the series down below, so check it out. That's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you've seen Erased and have thoughts about the writing, I would love to chat in the comments. And of course, feel free to leave your recs for other anime to cover in this series. Thanks again for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.